All right, welcome back to another episode of Asset Coach and Tax Strategist. So happy you're here. So, our last episode, we talked about correlation, non-correlation, dove into the weeds a little bit, kind of talked in a circle a little bit as well. But that's the whole point of it, is understanding and diving into the weeds and understanding that most of these conversations, when we're talking about economic termites, are going to lead to a circle. They're related to each other. And that's why it's so important to understand these weeds conversation. What do I mean that? By diving into these types of conversations, we're really getting to the weeds. That's important. We need to. You need to. Because at the end of the day, this is your money, right? When we talk about this kind of stuff, Asset Coach Tax Strategist talks about economic termites and farming assets. We talk about all this stuff. It's all designed to talk about the value of your hard work, which equates to your time. And your time equates to dollars, your dollars that you earn from your time away from your loved ones, okay? And so when you earn these dollars, you should work hard for these dollars one time. That's when you earn them. After that, every single one of these dollars has to work hard for you. So that's why we dive into some of these concepts into the weeds a little bit, and we don't do this every week because you would not be here every week. But we want to dive into these because all these different topics affect your money, and that's what we want to make sure we bring clarity to at a high level. Right now, bringing in this concept, if you want to dive farther and farther into the weeds, then great, that's awesome. And if you'd love us to do that, then let us know. Put that in the comment section. If you're a subscriber, awesome. Thank you so much for subscribing. If you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button. We drop episodes every Thursday. So now let's talk about this next context here. Centralized and decentralized. This has become big with the crypto markets. When crypto came on and Bitcoin came on, then all of a sudden this decentralization conversation came on. So what I want to do before we dive into what centralized versus decentralized is, let me let you know we're not giving investment advice. This is for informational purposes only. I don't know you. I don't know your situation. None of what I'm saying is giving you advice as if I know you. So please take this as just informational purposes only. We're not experts in this area. We're just a average asset coach tax strategist saying, hey, this is important information. I know enough. I've researched enough. Let's give some information. If you want to dive farther and farther into weeds, some awesome YouTube channels out there, some great content that will really go into the weeds of this. Specifically, you would have to go into the crypto YouTube space to really get a good feel of what decentralization means, because that's what really brought this to light, because everything else really hasn't. So I'm getting ahead of myself. So let me dive into what this is. So what's the difference between centralized and decentralized, first of all? Now, these are systems that lie in how authority, decision making, and control are distributed to you and I. Okay. Now, this concept applies to many areas, right? So let's think about this. It includes government, business, technology, and finance. Most of the time we hear about this from finance, like I was saying, crypto. But centralization in a government, all of this centralized conversation leads to control. Okay. The more you centralize things, the more you have control. This is why certain political parties want to bring everybody into these city type structures. Why? Higher population, more control in that area. Okay. That's why it's so key. So when you look at, for example, when you look at a political map, what do you see? I saw one show, I don't remember what show it was. It says, looks like blueberries in Chile. Right? So you have the entire state is red, but you go to the major cities in the states, what are they? They're blue. Why? They typically are liberal in nature, which is high density population, centralized control. Where do you find a lot of the homeless? Where do you find a lot of the low incomer? In the cities, by design. By design. Okay? And so that's important to understand. So this is not a political conversation. This is an understanding of centralized and decentralized and the core differences. So let's kind of dive into that. So let's look at authority first, right? Because I want to kind of give, this is not just about investments in your assets. Authority has an effect. Remember, what's one of the economic termites? Laws and regulations. Authority, your politicians, okay? So this is all about economic termites, taxes, inflation, time, laws, and regulations, okay? So authority is held by a single central entity, okay? So in the United States, it's the president. Other countries have different leaders. Then it drops down into, and this is why the founding fathers created the three separate bodies, right? Legislature, right? We have the legal side of things, right? The judicial, right? And then so when we have this structure, we're trying to decentralize it, but it's all centralized in a unified government essentially. So then you have political parties, right? So then you go into a state, you have a governor. You go into a town or a city, you have a mayor, right? And so on and so forth. Now, this could be spread among separate units, like I was talking about, the decentralization. So by having different states and governors, we're decentralizing. So the United States. So each state has its own, but each town has it's decentralized by each town having its own mayor. Okay, but you can see how that centralization occurs in that. Now, decision making, you can go top down, hierarchical, distributed, basically peer based on this from a decision making process. But control is concentrated in one place. That's the thing. Centralized control is central. It's one place, concentrated in one place. Now, when you have control, it's decentralized. It's spread out. Okay, so now, failure risk, this is a single point of failure when we're looking at centralization. When we're looking at failure risk and decentralization, it's more resilient and is less localized. It's you have different issues, okay? So you have that spread of risk. And we talked about this in correlation, non-correlation, really. You can look at speed, you can look at transparency, right? These are the different features of that in the core differences. So let's look at examples of context. Okay, let's look at business management. Business management's a great example. It's a good safe spot to go into right now. So what's centralized in business management? Well, you have decisions are made by a headquarter, a CEO or top management, right? So you have, for example, for franchises like McDonald's, okay, you have a certain rule or authority for all franchisees. Right? Now, decentralized are really like local branches or departments that make these decisions. So a local branch of a consulting firm sets its price or services based on local demand. So you could look at McDonald's as the same example. In McDonald's as an organization, in other countries, McDonald's has things on the menu that are local to that particular country and not necessarily here in the States or in each of the cities. Okay, so that's kind of the decentralization. So it could be in a same organization, but as it spreads out, it decentralizes more and more, right? Now let's go from business management. Now let's kind of go into the political aspect of government. And you have centralized, which you have national government, like I was talking about. But national government controls more aspects. So like you could have, we talk about the United States, but then you could have like North Korea, right? Where it's even more centralized, right? It really controls every aspect, and there's no avenue for decentralization. It is our way or the death way, right? Now, decentralized power is shared across other regions when we decentralize things. So again, the United States or Europe, Canada, or then you can drive into countries like Germany, where they have federal systems inside of Germany. Okay, as an example of that government. Now let's look at technology and network. Centralized is where all data flows through a main server in technology. So Facebook controls user data as an example, right? That's centralized with Facebook. Decentralized is data is stored and verified across different peer networks. So this is where blockchain conversation comes in, where you have peer-to-peer networks. Okay, so blockchain allows for this decentralization based on the structure of having these different nodes and these different areas of peer-to-peer networks. Okay, very important when we talk about that. Now, blockchain is not just specifically a currency like cryptocurrency. Blockchain is a technology of networks, okay, that creates these networks from peer to peer. Very, very important. And really, blockchain is expanding. We know it as, again, as currency and cryptocurrency, but blockchain has so many different benefits that really the technology network is really starting to go more and more into this blockchain avenue because it's kind of better for us. It decentralizes things. Okay, gives more security, so to speak. Lastly, let's go into finance. So we have centralized finance, which is like traditional banks and institutions. So what we know, we call these the financial distributors. So we have banks, insurance companies, investment companies, right? So within the centralized finance, so the Federal Reserve spits out money to the banking system, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, etc., right? So now when we look at decentralized or DeFi, so CeFi is centralized finance. DeFi, you hear this a lot of times, especially when in a cryptocurrency conversation, is decentralized finance. It operates without intermediaries, such as using smart contracts. So you have different decentralized type of networks out there. Example would be like Uniswap or Compound. And those, we're diving into more of the crypto side of things on that conversation. All right, now let's look at the advantages and disadvantages when we're coming to this dialogue and this conversation of what's better. Well, there's advantages and disadvantages to both. So let's look at centralized first, and let's look at the advantages. So clear chain of command, fast implementation of policies, easier to maintain consistency. That you and I would probably say, duh, obviously, right? Now, disadvantages, single point of failure, risk of abuse or corruption, or even less responsive to local needs. You and I could sit here and say, duh, right? That's part of the problem or benefit of centralized is those two advantages and disadvantages. But we know this. But also by knowing and understanding disadvantages, it allows us to understand how do we want to create those disadvantages into advantages. And that's what decentralization does, right? So as we go to decentralization, let's look at the advantages of decentralization. So first advantage, increases resilience and security. Yeah, it separates things, right? It's not all under one easy point of contact, right? It encourages innovation and diversity. That's really important to understand because in the innovation, you're always looking to try to diversify and kind of create this separation of we're all robots. We're all kind of standing in the separate line, right? And if you've seen any of these shows, like there was a show called Brain Games out there one time. And you've seen this differently as well. And if you've ever gone to an amusement park or a state fair, you'll see this all the time. You'll walk up and everybody's standing in a line, and you're like, "Oh, okay, cool." And it's kind of near like where the food would be, or the bathroom, where people would have to stand in line and congregate to be able to use or purchase, right? So you stand in line. You really don't know what that line's for, but you're standing in line, right? And finally, you ask the person in front of you, well, what line is this for, right? And so they're like, I think this is for the food line. Oh, but you don't know for sure. No. We got this because we were looking to get some turkey legs. Okay. So you lean over to your spouse and you say, hey, go walk up to the front, make sure we're in the right line. And all of a sudden they walk up, and then there's actually no line. It was just a group of people that were standing together, congregating, and other people not paying attention who wanted food just got in there because it looked like they were in a line. But there was nobody in line, right? So that's kind of what happens to us a lot of times. Okay? So decentralization would be that simple thing of, oh, there is no line, right? More adaptable. One last advantage, more adaptable to local or individual needs. We know this from advantages, right, of decentralization. Now, there are disadvantages to decentralization. Coordination challenges. Yeah. So right now, like in cryptocurrency, you have all these different types of projects. You kind of see this in government agencies where you have overlapping, or you have institutions like university research institutions where they're all looking for the cure of cancer, but they're all separately working, right? They're all decentralized and they're all spending tons of money in all this research, but not sharing data, right? Slower decision making tends to be slower decision making in the sense that you have these different segments, these different structures. So as a whole unit, it's difficult to make. Now each little separate unit can make a decision, but as a whole, it makes it difficult because there's inconsistency across these different parts. Okay, so now the disadvantages of centralization are the advantages of centralization. The disadvantages of centralized is the advantages decentralized, right? So the opposites attract, right? So in summary, why is this important? This is important because when we start talking about your investments, we start talking about your finances, we start talking about what's important to you and your money, is understanding centralized, how it affects you. Traditional financial systems, investment platforms that have a central authority, we call them the financial distributors, right? Banks and investment companies. Also insurance companies, but with insurance companies, they offer contracts and they tend to be safer depending on the structure of how it is with the rest of your. So banks, they again, and I have a video content on this on our channel. So if you're interested in learning about what we call the financial distributors, watch the video that we have on that. But at the end of the day, you need to understand the existing systems and how they work. So Fidelity, Robinhood, Charles Schwab, those are all centralized. You can look at crypto exchanges like Coinbase or Binance. Those are all centralized. Okay. Now the characteristics, typically the custody and control over your assets, they're held by this particular institution. That's what creates that safety. Also, know your customer, KYC. There's rules and regulations that apply. So I, as a professional, have to abide by certain regulations and rules so we can create that safety for you. Right, and it creates this insured, regulated type of offering or sense of safety. Right, that's important. That's what centralization does. Now, the implications for you and I as investors is it's easier to use, right, especially for beginners, and generally you have more customer support because everything's pretty much the same. And the hard thing though is you have risk of failure. So, right, for example, in the crypto side, you had a centralized exchange called FTX. It collapsed. What happened? Well, they didn't have a lot of what we were talking about is these characteristics under centralized finance. Though it was kind of characterized as centralized, there was no safeguards and controls within that. Okay. Now, when we look at decentralized finance, we're looking at blockchain-based financial systems. Again, we're going to that blockchain where peer-to-peer operates without centralized intermediaries using what we call smart contracts. So you have Uniswap, Aave, Curve, Compound, and the list goes on and on. This is a growing marketplace. Now, characteristics for you and I to understand in this area is that you hold your own assets via digital wallets. Now, how's this work as an investor? So remember I used that word accredited investor in my last episode. And I think we've done an episode on what an accredited investor is. If we haven't, then we probably should. But basically, as an accredited investor, you have the authority to have control over your own assets and where they go. You and I would sit there and go, well, duh, it's my money. Yeah, but in centralized and correlation, doesn't necessarily all mean you have control. You're not holding your own assets. In decentralized finance, you're holding your own assets typically in what we call a digital wallet. Okay. Not with it's in your own protected wallet. It's not with Fidelity, so to speak. Transactions are executed via code, not people. Okay. And you have open access, so you have no borders, no intermediaries that are between you. It's everything's open. Okay. Now there's implications for you and I as investors with this. Okay. The implications are higher potential returns, right? More risk, more reward potentially, right? There's different things called staking, yield farming, liquidity pools. These are all different characteristics within the blockchain, crypto, decentralized world. If you don't know what I just said, these are all there's a lot of weeds to dive into, rabbit holes to dive into with staking, yield farming, and liquidity pools. Awesome when you know about it. Amazing that it's there and available. But again, potentially higher returns also means you have to be decentralized. You have to take a little more risk for a potentially higher return, right? Greater autonomy and transparency, but more responsibility and risk. Okay, so that almost sounds like they shouldn't go together. But you have the autonomy and transparency. So public blockchain, everybody sees the chain. Now you have your own private wallet, but you also have public chain wallet, right? Where everyone sees a transaction. That creates that transparency, but more responsibility and risk associated with that. Okay. So now this exposure to innovative financial products like tokenized assets, synthetic stocks, that kind of stuff. Again, this is the wild west of currency. It's the crypto world. You really need to do your homework. You really need to understand the different aspects. You can't just jump into it because there's potentially higher returns, but you can't be blinded by that. There is a lot more risk associated with that. And this comes down to risk and control dynamics. Okay. So for example, control in a centralized area, you have a firm or platform that manages your assets, right? Like a Fidelity or Schwab or Robinhood. Okay. Decentralized, you control your private keys and your funds. Okay. So, but transparency is another area. So transparency in centralized depends on disclosure laws. So what laws allow for transparency? On decentralized, it's full visibility of smart contracts and ledgers. And those were the addresses that I was talking about. These are public addresses, which are different than private wallet addresses. Another factor is security risk. So in centralized, you're vulnerable to internal fraud or hacks, which is why there's a lot of regulations and laws. So you have certain thing like Ponzi schemes. They still happen. They happen quite often, unfortunately. But these are things that are out there and vulnerable to this. And even though you're centralized, it's when people start getting out of centralized type of structure where these Ponzi schemes start to happen more often. But they do happen in these centralized areas, right? Bernie Madoff is a great example. Okay. Now, decentralized, when it comes to security risk, you're more vulnerable to bugs in code or rug pulls. Rug pulls meaning that somebody creates a currency, people are investing in this currency, they love the project, they're excited about it, and then all of a sudden, a rug pull is just like what it sounds. All of a sudden, someone pulls out all the money. It ends up being a scam, and everybody's sitting on the rug. What happens? Falls over. That's unfortunately happens in decentralization. It does. That's the risk. Now, another factor is access. So by centralized investments, you have limited by geography and regulations. But decentralized, you have more global accessibility. Now, you can go into Forex, foreign exchange, and trade currencies, and you have global accessibility. But also in centralized structure, you have global accessibility also. You just got to go to those centralized exchanges. So like the Japanese stock exchange, or the German, or the English, the Britain's stock exchange. So you can still invest in centralized in globally, but you have to enter these safe spaces, so to speak, these centralized areas. Okay. So when we come to, let's really talk about access and inclusion. So when we're talking about the centralized systems, it often excludes unbanked population. This is why decentralization, cryptocurrency became so big. A lot of these people trying to help the unbanked. There's a huge population that does not have access to banks. Therefore, they don't have access to small loans. So you have these micro loans that becomes very popular to help a guy get a loan, get $500 loan so he could buy a cow and be able to help his town. You and I sit here and go, it's $500. They're saying it's a cow that can change all our lives. But if you're unbanked and you can't get access to just $500, you can see how this becomes a problem, right? So decentralized systems allow really anyone with internet access. So here's the key though, internet access. So if there's this, decentralization and this whole conversation of prepping and all this, but if all of a sudden the AIs take over, there has to be an internet structure to allow AIs to take over, which means you and I have access to internet, which you and I have access to our decentralized. Or do we? Right? There's always a system of control. It just means there's less control or there's more options for issues to occur in decentralization. So I think there's a good balance between these two and understanding really your portfolio diversification, which is the next thing. Decentralized has introduced new asset classes. So Bitcoin, right? Previous administration, cryptocurrency was horrible. This administration, it's the new system, new currency. The first time we have a new asset class in 500 plus years, right? So Bitcoin, Ethereum, these are important aspects, but those are cryptocurrencies. Tokenized assets would be real estate, where you can actually take real estate, create a cryptocurrency that is the asset that backs that cryptocurrency is real estate. So you've tokenized that asset. And these are projects, we call them real assets, right? These are cryptocurrency real asset projects that are happening right now, okay? NFTs and digital collectibles, okay? This is an area of this. And you see a lot of athletes getting into this NFT marketplace, digitalizing their persona and their personality. And then DeFi interest earning tools, like I was mentioning earlier, liquidity pools, that kind of stuff. So let's look at the regulatory landscape here. And this is kind of really the last part of this and the risks. Centralized platforms are regulated. That's why decentralized was created, because they got overly regulated. That sense of control took away our freedoms, so we felt like we could be subject to government seizures and restrictions and internal mismanagement. All accurate issues, which is what strived the creation of Bitcoin and the cryptocurrency and blockchain revolution. Now, decentralized investments are borderless, but they do face regulatory uncertainty and less consumer protection. So if that's important to you, then you probably shouldn't go down this decentralized pathway until it becomes more and more regulated. And that's what the current administration is trying to do, is create structure in the cryptocurrency structure. Now, by creating structure in cryptocurrency, it is taking decentralized and centralizing some of it. Some of it, not all of it. Okay. So there's that balance. You need to understand there's that balance. Okay. So really the final kind of takeaway, and let's close it up here with centralized versus decentralized. With the centralized, there's some benefits: simplicity, regulation, and support. The risks with centralized are less control and a central point of failure, right? On the decentralized side, the benefit is transparency, innovation, and autonomy. The risks with decentralization would be complexity, smart contract risk, and limited recourse. In somebody who is in the crypto side of things and learning crypto and having my own wallets and understanding, there is a complexity to it. And there's a consistency and a repetitiveness to the complexity that simplifies it. So you have to be involved. You have to understand what you're doing, because if you don't and you make a simple mistake, you could lock yourself out of your own assets. So education is extremely important in understanding what you're doing in both centralized and decentralized. So hopefully this was helpful. Again, dove into the weeds a little bit, but I thought this would be very, very important in understanding the differences. Again, probably each one of these could have an entirely separate episode, and maybe based on your comments, we would do that. Not to be the crypto or the decentralized authority, but just try to give you enough information to go learn. It's like, ooh, that's scary. I'm not going to do that. Or, I'm interested. I want to know more. That's the whole point of this channel. I want to know more. So thanks so much for being a subscriber. Again, if you're not in this content, you're like, wow, I really like what this guy does. First of all, give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button, and we drop episodes every Thursday. And if you have any questions, comments, or ideas of future content, put all that in the comment section. We really appreciate it. Until then, make it a great day.